Being prepared is now considered suspicious. That's the standard quietly revealed in the killing of Alex Pretti, not through legislation, not through a court ruling, but through how the state explained his death. According to that explanation, what mattered wasn't a crime. It wasn't an attack, it was equipment. An extra magazine, recast as evidence of nefarious intent. That detail matters because it flips the burden instantly. Preparation stops being neutral, lawful carry stops being protected. The moment a badge enters the frame, intent is no longer judged by what you do, but by what you have. And if you're someone who carries responsibly, this isn't a political debate, it's a personal risk calculation. Because once possession alone is enough to justify force, there's no safe behavior left to default to. Compliance doesn't save you, legality doesn't shield you. Everything hinges on how you are perceived in seconds you don't control. And here's the part most people miss. This wasn't confusion, it was coordination, and that changes how you should read everything that came next. What followed wasn't hesitation, it was movement. Almost immediately after the Minneapolis shooting, the story was framed from the top down. Senior officials went public in rapid succession, delivering the same message through different mouths. The emphasis was consistent. Pretti wasn't discussed as a citizen caught in a tragic moment. He was framed as a danger, neutralized before damage could occur. But notice how the framing worked. Only part of the picture was ever shown. The focus stayed locked on characterization, not chronology, on intent, not sequence, on what he carried, not what he did. That selectivity matters because it places this case inside a larger pattern, one where reputational defense of institutions moves faster than fact-finding and where narrative control becomes the first priority. This is where the issue stops being about a single shooting. It becomes about how power responds under pressure. When the same language appears across agencies, across interviews, across days, it signals alignment, not error, not improvisation, strategy. So here's the question that reframes everything. If this was about clarity, why did they only give you part of the story? Because partial information isn't a mistake, it's a tool. Here's the doctrine that emerged once the messaging settled. A federal prosecutor said it plainly. Approaching law enforcement while armed creates a high likelihood officers are legally justified in shooting you. That sentence does more work than pages of legal argument. It doesn't describe a rare edge case. It defines a baseline. Carrying a firearm becomes the trigger condition itself. Think about what that means in practice. A permit doesn't function as protection. It functions as background information, something that exists on paper while reality operates on perception. The moment a weapon is detected, the interaction is reclassified, not as lawful engagement, but as imminent threat. Lethal force becomes presumptively reasonable. Notice what's missing from that standard. There's no reference to hostile action, no requirement of escalation, no distinction between intent and presence. The logic skips straight to outcome. And once that logic is accepted, it retroactively sanitizes whatever follows. This is where the story tightens. Because the statement isn't framed as an opinion, it's framed as an explanation, as if this is how things already work and everyone should have known. If that's true, then the question isn't whether Pretti was justified in being shot. It's whether lawful carry has any meaning at all once an officer is involved. And that's where the implications start to spread. This is where the narrative expands beyond the case and into identity. The administration built its political brand on being the most gun-friendly in modern history. Speeches said one thing, campaign promises said another. But when faced with a moment that tested those claims in real time, the response ran in the opposite direction. Federal power closed ranks. The rights of a supporter became secondary to the immunity of the state. That contrast isn't subtle. On the surface, the language of support remains. Behind it, the machinery behaves differently. Cabinet officials defend the shooting. Prosecutors articulate standards that hollow out the right they claim to respect. The message is implicit but unmistakable. Advocacy ends where enforcement begins. We've seen this tension before, not in slogans, but in moments of crisis. When power is forced to choose between maintaining authority and honoring principle, it rarely hesitates. What's new here is how openly that choice was defended. There was no walk back, no pause, just normalization. And normalization is the dangerous part, because once a base realizes that loyalty doesn't protect them when institutions are under threat, something fractures. Trust doesn't explode, it erodes quietly, permanently. This is where the story stops being about hypocrisy and starts being about consequences. There was a warning embedded years ago that now reads differently in hindsight. When the idea surfaced that firearms could be taken first and justified later, it was dismissed as rhetoric, a one-off comment, a moment of frustration. But what you're seeing here is that impulse translated into action without ever saying its name. In this case, there was no seizure before a hearing. There was no court at all. The assessment came first. The outcome followed. The justification rested on a familiar move. Declare intent after the fact, point to equipment, use that equipment to imply motive, and once motive is established rhetorically, due process becomes irrelevant. There's nothing left to adjudicate. The decision has already been framed as unavoidable. Here's the contradiction that should stick with you. The state didn't argue that Alex Pretti broke the law. It argued that his preparation erased his entitlement to it. That's a fundamental shift. Rights aren't revoked by violation. They're overridden by interpretation. This is where the story flips again. Because when executive judgment replaces legal process, the question isn't whether mistakes will happen. It's how often they'll be defended as policy. And that's a much bigger problem than any single incident. Then the pressure stacks fast. Multiple narratives collide at once, and none of them are allowed to fully surface. On one side, there are reports suggesting a different role for Pretti, a good Samaritan, someone intervening, not threatening. On the other, there's an aggressive effort to shut that framing down before it gains oxygen. The tone shifts, the attacks sharpen, the character assassination accelerates. That speed is the tell. If the alternative story didn't matter, it wouldn't need to be buried. But it does matter because it introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty is dangerous to a justification built on inevitability. So the response isn't to clarify, it's to overwhelm, to flood the space with repetition until the competing version feels irresponsible to even mention. At the same time, the political machinery hums along. Allies stay quiet. Critics focus narrowly. No one in power pauses the process. The system keeps moving, even as the ground underneath it shifts. This is what loss of control looks like in real time. Not chaos, but acceleration. Too many variables, too little patience, and a growing sense that the outcome has to be defended now before anyone asks the wrong question. So ask it. At some point, the abstraction breaks, because policies don't land on institutions first. They land on people, on how you behave when you're unsure how you'll be interpreted, on whether you step in to help or step back to stay alive, on whether you trust that following the rules will protect you when it matters. In Minneapolis, the reaction wasn't just outrage, it was fear. Not fear of crime, but fear of misreading. Fear that legality no longer guarantees restraint. When the state signals that lawful carry itself escalates risk, ordinary interactions change. People hesitate, they disengage, they avoid contact, not because they're guilty, but because they're cautious. And that caution spreads. It reshapes communities. It widens the distance between citizens and authority, not through ideology, but through experience. Once people believe that intent can be assigned after the fact, trust becomes a liability. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. Because the most powerful effects of this case aren't visible on camera. They show up in what people decide not to do the next time a moment demands it. And that's where the deeper mechanism comes into view. What allows this pattern to repeat isn't outrage or silence. It's incentives. Institutions don't move based on fairness. They move based on risk exposure. From that perspective, the priority is simple. Protect the agent. Protect the department, protect the chain of authority. Everything else becomes secondary. Language is adjusted to support that goal. Standards are framed to absorb liability. Narratives are constructed to close ranks. That's why intent becomes so useful. Intent is malleable. It can be inferred, expanded, reinterpreted. It doesn't require proof in the moment. Actions do, and actions invite scrutiny. By shifting focus away from behavior and toward perception, the system minimizes uncertainty for itself, even as it creates uncertainty for everyone else. This isn't about good people or bad people. It's about leverage. When one side controls the story, the process, and the enforcement, accountability becomes optional, especially when the cost of pushing back feels higher than the cost of compliance. This is what makes the situation unsettling. Not anger, not chaos, but efficiency. A system learning it can move this way and absorb the consequences. Once that lesson is learned, it doesn't unlearn itself. It looks for the next opportunity. From here, the path forward splits, but neither direction is clean. One path is normalization. The Pretti standard quietly becomes precedent. Future cases reference it. Training adapts around it. Interactions become tighter, faster, more defensive. Lawful carry remains legal in theory, but increasingly risky in practice. People adjust without being told to. They avoid involvement. They disengage. Rights stay intact on paper while behavior changes on the ground. The other path is friction, not immediate revolt, but gradual resistance. Voters disengage, support softens, motivation drops, not because people switch sides, but because they stop believing the system represents them. The danger here isn't backlash, it's apathy, a slow withdrawal that's harder to measure and easier to ignore until it shows up in turnout, trust, and legitimacy. What matters is that momentum is already forming. Every official statement, every defended outcome, every repeated justification nudges the system further down one of these paths, and the next decision won't announce itself loudly. You'll recognize it by how familiar it feels. There's one final insight that ties all of this together. The most effective way to limit a right isn't to ban it. It's to make exercising it feel dangerous. When survival depends on discretion instead of legality, the right still exists, but only for those willing to risk the cost. That's the real legacy of the Pretti case. Not a ruling, not a policy, a lesson about how power protects itself and how quickly the space for ordinary citizens can narrow without a single law changing. This story isn't finished. The pattern is still unfolding. If you want to understand where it goes next, follow and subscribe.